we used to have mass democracies where politicians were concerned about protests in the streets, about workers who could shut down the economy, literally. So there was a much more even balance there, because politicians had to consider the needs of workers just as they had to consider the needs of businesses. That was the foundation of social democracy. It was the fact that you had this relatively even balance between workers and bosses, and politicians in the middle trying to mediate between these two groups. That's what we've lost, is a sense of the collective power of ordinary people.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Grace Blakeley. Grace is a political economist. She's a staff writer at Tribune and the author of several books, including her most recent, Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom. She's also recently launched a new project, the What Can We Do newsletter. This project aims to remind us that collective action is not only possible, but it is already happening all the time. And this is what Grace joins me to discuss: the imbalance of power between states, markets, and the rest of us, which is deteriorating the everyday economy, our well-being, our lives, our relationships, and what to do about it. Grace explains in this episode that the so-called divide between the markets and the state is nonsense, that the states and markets have always worked in tandem to buttress one another, and that after the labour movement was dismantled during the Thatcher and Reagan era, the necessary checks and balances from everyday people were obliterated, unleashing a system which was always designed for the rich to get richer. We also discuss the fact that we live in a world of two economies: the ethereal, abstracted economy that politicians and economists discuss, and the everyday economy that we all exist in all the time, with Grace revealing why it is that politicians capitulate to that other economy, and why, despite growth going up and the economy allegedly being strong, everybody's lives are getting worse. Finally, we discuss individualism versus collectivism, the fact that the ruling class are incredibly collective, while the rest of us are forced to fight over scraps, with Grace explaining that the only way to seize power back is to do so together. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community, who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Grace, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
My first question for you is, why is the world in crisis?
So my answer to the question why the world is in crisis centers on the fact that we live in a capitalist world economy. And what does that mean? It basically means that we live in societies that are divided between a group of people who own everything and who make the decisions about how those resources are used, and then a much larger group of people who are forced to basically work for a living. And if they're unable to do that, then they're kind of consigned to conditions of destitution, basically. Now, it's really important to understand capitalism as this system that is a class-divided system, because there are a lot of people who will tell you capitalism is a system that's, based around free markets, and often free markets and democracy, right? And if you understand capitalism in that sense, then it's hard to pinpoint why it would have led us to a point of such significant crisis, because you could say, well, the problem today is that we have big monopolistic corporations that control vast, swathes of resources, and they exploit those resources for profit and do so at the expense of people and planet. But that's not capitalism, because they don't exist in a free market, because those are monopolies. Or you could say, the problem is that actually governments continuously intervene to prop up big businesses or, financial institutions. And that's not capitalism either, because the government is intervening in the free market. And this is the kind of, the idea that the system that we live in now is not real capitalism. It's some form of kind of, perverted capitalism that doesn't kind of ring true to the roots of what that system was supposed to look like. And actually what I argue in my most recent book, Vulture Capitalism, is that it is functioning exactly as it was supposed to. Because when you understand how this system really works, and you see that actually it has nothing to do with free markets, it's never had anything to do with free markets, all the way back to the origins of capitalism with the East India Company, that was a collaboration between merchants and the British state to set up a big monopoly that could run the British Empire. Capitalism has always been a system based on collusion between, politicians and big businesses. It's always been a system where corporations have attempted to expand their control over markets. The thing that has defined that system throughout the entire course of its existence has always been the fact that there's been this small number of people who control all the resources, make all the decisions, and use their power and influence to basically dominate and control everyone else. And what's been different over the course of those several hundred years has been whether or not everyone else has been capable of resisting the exercise of that power, or whether they've been so scattered and divided that the elites have been able to basically do whatever they want. And we're in one of those periods now.
Is there a period in very recent history in which people were successful in resisting the enclosure of their lives and livelihoods?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the history of capitalism, you have to look at it as shifts in the balance of class power, basically. So it's never the case that the power of those at the top, the power of capital, is total, but it's also never the case that workers and communities have complete control over what's going on. But today we live in a world in which the scales are tipped like very, very sharply in favor of big businesses and the powerful states that support their interests. If you go back in history, kind of 60, 70 years, say, in the rich world, to the post-war consensus, to the period where you had a much stronger labor movement, you had stronger kind of social movements, you just had groups of collectives that were capable of resisting the power of big business, resisting the power of the state very effectively. Those were times when our societies were more equal. They weren't perfect. The global economy was still very unequal. Although, again, the balance of power between rich countries and poor countries was less significantly tilted in one direction rather than another. But, if you look at, for example, the UK or the US, you had strong labor unions, you had a strong peace movement, environmental movements. And at the end of the 60s and 70s, they all started working together really quite effectively and resisting, arbitrary authority from the state, resisting the power of big business to, for example, force workers to pay for inflation in the form of lower wages. And that was when we got the neoliberal revolution, which is not a coincidence. It was designed precisely to push back against that organized power and reassert the dominance of those at the top. This was a project, Thatcher and Reagan, free markets, that was kind of cloaked in the language of freedom. It was about privatization and shrinking the state and creating greater space for free markets. But that was all really a kind of cloak behind which hid the real mission, which was just reasserting the authority of those at the top of society, of the big businesses and the politicians that were working alongside them. And that kind of culture of hierarchy and domination, I would argue, is actually central to the way that capitalism works, even though its advocates claim that it's this nice, decentralized free market system.
It's interesting to think about how there's been a capture of facts. I think I'm going to call that a capture of facts. How this collusion between market and state is totally embedded into capitalism, and it's kind of sort of built out from, you know, the old sort of feudal times in which there were men that were kings and they had all the resources, and yet it was their armies that were going out and extracting those resources in order to sort of power the kingdom. And it's so interesting to kind of live in a time now where that very evident relationship, which is evidenced by subsidies or by the very fact that governments need a fuel source in order to run, and typically, certainly in the Western world, that is provided by private companies, that they have managed to kind of both put it on one another and thus obfuscate the very nature of their relationship. And that's why you can have men like Trump sort of saying like, oh, it's, you know, it's the fault of the big state. As a businessman, it's the fault of the big state and we need to reduce it. Or even governments like our own in the UK sort of saying, oh, it's the fault of fossil fuel companies, not the fault that we actually haven't invested in any kind of other meaningful infrastructure since the warnings that, you know, were first raised in the 60s and 70s. So how is it that we can go about sort of revealing that relationship more? And also, what is it that we can actually do about it, given they are so kind of enmeshed now? It really does feel impossible to kind of reform one without toppling the other, which could lead further down the line to really quite dramatic consequences just for everybody else.
Yeah, look, I mean, ideology is a very, very powerful thing. And, you know, the ideas that we kind of hold on to, often subconsciously, and which we use to process any new information, they're kind of incredibly powerful filters through which we see the world, right? And the filter that a lot of people have is one that has been really kind of strengthened and disseminated by basically the right. And it's this view that the world is divided into governments on the one hand and then markets on the other hand. And, you know, the government is a kind of inefficient, authoritarian, unaccountable system. And markets are these kind of nice, decentralized spaces in which kind of free market interactions can take place. And that is a kind of a framework that was spread by the right, but it's also something that was tacitly accepted by the left. And if you think just about the kind of history of ideas, you know, we had in the kind of late 1800s, you know, when capitalism was kind of, when industrial capitalism was really starting to become embedded, we did have this idea pushed by very early free market economists that there was this natural market mechanism and the government should step away and allow markets to kind of take their course. It was after the Wall Street crash in the 1920s when you had the rise of Keynes and Keynesianism, who came in and said, actually, no, markets don't function very effectively when you leave them on their own. You need governments to step in and tame them. And that ideology became hegemonic. It became very powerful after the Second World War, and in fact during the Second World War, when governments basically realized that they needed to step up and build a war economy. And then after that, they kind of created social democratic states with support from the labor movement. And they used Keynes's ideas, which were also based on this perceived separation between markets and states, to then build a left-wing model, right? And then you had the 1980s when that was flipped on its head again, and people came in and said, well, actually the state's gotten too big and too powerful, so we need to tame it and create more space for the market again. For over 100 years, we've had this tacit acceptance by all of our politicians, all big political thinkers, that there is this separation. And it's just not true. If you go back to before that period, to when, for example, Marx was writing, he said things like, you know, the capitalist state is nothing but a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie, i.e. the capitalist state does largely what big business wants it to do. And this is Marx, who's often, you know, by people who don't really understand, characterized as a thinker who advocated for a big state doing lots of things on everyone else's behalf. It just shows how much the, you know, political ideology has been influenced by this very, very pervasive and wrong idea that you can separate markets and states, and you can have a nice independent government that, acts very rationally to make sure that the market operates in an effective way, or you can have markets that exist separate from states and which, largely kind of function according to their own logic. It's just not true. What happens in markets is determined by politics, and politics is determined by what happens in markets. Because, if you have policymakers who are trying to make decisions about the future of a society, you're going to have big businesses and lobbyists who are working to influence their decision making. And then, of course, those politicians will make laws, will make regulations, create, tax law, all of this sort of stuff that then affects what goes on in the economy. So changing that system, it requires more than just this endless back and forth we've had for such a long time between more market, more government. It actually requires a shift in the balance of power within society. I have this argument in Vulture Capitalism, which is the problem is not an imbalance between the private sector and the public sector. It's not that politicians have too much power, or even corporate executives have too much power, because the power that big business derives comes in large part from its relationship with the state. The imbalance is an imbalance of power between elites and everyone else. Bosses have too much power over workers. Governments have too much power over citizens. Rich countries have too much power over poor ones. And all of these forms of domination kind of pervade the society in which we live. And the idea that we could shift from one side to the other and just say, right, we'll get a state that's a bit bigger so it can manage the market, or reduce the state to give more space for big business, it's just for the birds. And I think that is becoming obvious now. This ideological veil that we've had for over a century is starting to lift, because you just see so clearly when Elon Musk and Donald Trump are working together to manage the US state and manage the US economy. It's like, okay, well, you can't really argue that those two things are separate anymore. And that's actually a very interesting moment, because the legitimacy of the system that we have now rests on the idea that there is an independent government and that there is a free market. And when people start to realize, we don't have an independent government and we don't have free markets, then that's going to really, create quite a lot of problems. It's going to mean that people no longer by default accept that this system is right. Though that, as we're seeing, potentially benefits the far right, which says, let's burn the whole thing down and kind of put this charismatic leader at the head of our new system, just as much as it would ever benefit the left.
There's a very interesting kind of hall of mirrors effect, I feel like, sort of existing today and attempting to be politically and economically aware. And you speak to it as well, like the tautology of, government and markets kind of both being the origin and the end of either. And to me, a part of this seems to be like we've forgotten the very first level of inputs. So for all of the talk of economics, for example, you don't really read economists anymore, or commentators anymore, talking about what actually is the backbone of the economy. Marx wrote that it was labor, or you have some post-Keynesian economists now talking about the input of natural resources. But it does seem to be all kind of, or in the mainstream, economics and politics are sort of talked about as if divorced from the real world, as if divorced from people's lived experiences, and as if divorced from the actual kind of laws of the universe that make the world go round. And one of those things is GDP. Even though GDP was decoupled from, the increase of well-being or living standards, after the 2008 financial crash, we still have, it's so goddamn boring. It doesn't matter if it's one of the Tory finance ministers or if it's Rachel Reeves, it's still growth, despite the fact that there being no actual tangible evidence for that being a meaningful goal anymore. And I think it's therefore understandable that the public, who are living incredibly precarious and unstable lives, take very little interest or notice of what is going on politically, because there's that sense of it not meaning anything anymore. There's that sense of not just economics not trickling down, but economic theory not trickling down. And so it's a bit of a wild card question, but what other language plays are happening with markets and government, economics and political theory that have sort of gone beyond, the chicken and the egg reality that we're living in, and just kind of into this world of I don't know, just a totally linguistic territory that is actually, become meaningless.
It's such a good point. The kind of divorce between people's lived experience about the economy and then the way, particularly that politicians talk about the economy, but also, policymakers in general, is so significant. Because we've had, largely since the financial crisis, let's say, we've had politicians and policymakers saying, the economy is growing. Sometimes it hasn't been growing particularly quickly, but it's been growing. We've had politicians saying employment is the highest it's ever been. We had record levels of employment, as in the number of people who are in the labor force, right? We had extremely low inflation for a very long period of time, and we had booming financial markets. And so politicians would cite all of this evidence for the fact that, the economy was doing really well. And people obviously naturally tacitly assume when the economy is doing well, then that must be good for me. That must mean that my life is going to get better in some way. You saw a similar sort of thing in the US, right? And there was a bunch of evidence actually recently about the most recent election. The Republicans and Democrats were really split on their views of how the economy was doing, like, whether or not the economy was growing. And basically, like, Republicans were more likely to say that the economy was performing badly, and Democrats were more likely to say it was performing well, right? And this is because, it's not because, those two groups had wildly differing experiences of the economy, because, that they're relatively evenly spread out across a lot of different socioeconomic groups, and their perceptions of the economy were just so extremely divergent. It's because the economy has become this kind of floating signifier of like, how do you feel? How do you feel about the future? What do you think is going to happen? And it's a very kind of future oriented thing as well. It's like, do you think things are going to get better for you, for example? And it is no surprise that that's happened because, we've had this very long period of time of employment's great, inflation is low, things are growing, it's going to get better in the future. And everyone's lives either stagnating or getting worse. Right? Unless you're in the top 10%, maybe, right? Because living standards have barely budged, particularly over the last 5 years. But even before then, we had the longest period in the UK of wage stagnation since like the 1850s. Wages just flatlined, even as asset prices rose. So how are you going to afford a house when your wages are stagnant? House prices are rising. We had, increases in poverty. There was, there's lots of debate about whether or not inequality has in fact increased. But when you account for tax avoidance and evasion, then yes, it has, unsurprisingly. HMRC statistics say that it hasn't, but that's because, surprise, surprise, the rich aren't reporting their taxes correctly. And we just had this like rot in our society and social fabric, which was that everything stopped working. Public services stopped working. It became so much harder to get a doctor's appointment. Even like things like our public spaces deteriorated. People started to see much more homelessness. We started to see kind of the deterioration of nature. Our waterways obviously became much more polluted. Similar sorts of processes happening in the US, although the change was much starker in the UK with the shift towards austerity. And then the cost of living crisis hit, the pandemic, of course, first, and then the cost of living crisis. And that made things turn once again for the worst, where not only had wages stagnated now for over a decade, but now if you accounted for inflation, we saw these huge declines in living standards and purchasing power, which, they have just started to recover, let's say last year or the year before, maybe in the US. And which now are tailing off again because growth is slowing, inflation is rising again. All of these kind of deep-rooted problems about the way the economy is organizing are rearing their ugly heads. And in the UK, there's a statistic from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, the living standards of the bottom 40% aren't going to return to 2022 levels until 2028. And they weren't high in 2022, right? In the US, you've had income stagnating over the last few years. And that's, probably going to continue. The US may even enter recession, given the fact that, this is another subject, but the AI bubble is going to pop at some point and there'll be a stock market crash. And then Trump's massively increasing joblessness by trying to lay off a bunch of federal workers. So there's just this divorce between what we hear about the economy, largely from politicians, and then the vast majority of people's experience of the economy that means that it loses reality as a phrase. It ceases to become grounded in anything real. And yet it still retains this massive importance in our political discourse. And people attach a load of different stuff to what, growth is. And it creates really, really unhealthy dynamics because you can just say growth, 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 growth. If I cut taxes, it's going to boost growth. I've got an economist over here who'll back it up for me. And everyone says, great, well, growth is probably good. So let's vote for this person who's going to cut taxes for the rich to boost growth. And then it doesn't work. And then someone even further to the right says, oh, well, yeah, but that didn't work because actually there's too many migrants and they're the ones that are making you poor. So because this is completely divorced from people's actual sense of living standards, because we don't have any politicians talking about living standards, about how they're going to make working people's lives better, our whole discussion around the economy has just become completely divorced from reality.
I'm always amazed at how boring living through probably one of the worst crises since the last mass extinction is. Because it's just the same shit said, you just circle the toilet drain, whether it's, climate solutions on mainstream television from politicians that center around net zero, as if the planet can fall for accounting tricks. Whether it's, politicians on both sides of the aisle just bleating on about growth as if that actually means anything. It's like, it's like the neoliberalism has kind of climaxed in this capacity to actually take meaningfulness away also from language. Like it took meaningfulness away from our relationships and from our work and from our sense of purpose. And now it's come from the tool that we use to make sense of the world in this kind of, last hurrah, fuck you to the rest of us. And so I'd like to kind of go back to, what is an economy? How do we tether it to real people? And how can people get the sense that, hey, you get to make one too? That we're all existing in economies all of the time, aren't we?
Yeah. There are lots of different ways to understand the economy. And I would argue that in reality, there's probably two economies, right? There is the economy in which we live, we work, we play, we buy, right? It's grounded much more in our communities. It's grounded often in place, in the place we live and work. It's, going to the shops and buying something. It's jumping on a train to go to work. It's going to your place of work. All these things are, embedded in a kind of reality that makes it easy for you to kind of see what's going on. If the price of milk goes up, if, you can't get to work because the traffic's too bad or, the trains don't work anymore. How many hours you have to spend at work. And all of these things feed into these metrics around the economy and, how much you earn. All of these things have a very real impact on your life. And then there's the kind of economy as like an abstraction, which is, the measurement of wages in total, the measurement of profits in total. And that then feeds into the prices of these things called assets, right? Which are these kind of legal constructions based on an underlying physical thing. Like a share, for example, is an asset that is a claim on the profits of a company. And those shares are traded in financial markets where investors make bets about the likely future profits of that company. Now, those two things are linked, right? If you have a, sudden crash, let's say, in investors' expectations about the future, suddenly everyone starts thinking the economy's going to do badly in the future. So they reduce investment. That reduced investment means corporations have, less cash. Their share prices collapse. they think, oh, right, things are going to get worse, I'm going to lay off workers, then that starts to affect you in your real life, in the real economy, right? You know, might lose your job, you might have to work a lot harder, you might have to get a new job, whatever. The same thing with inflation. That's something that can start anywhere. It can start in, you know, the imaginations of a group of people. Let's say if they decide I'm going to, like in, for example, the 1970s, the oil producing countries created this cartel, OPEC, and they decided we're going to make oil prices higher for lots of different reasons. That boosted prices throughout the whole of the economy and created inflation. It might be that countries go to war and that makes resources much more scarce. It might be that something very real happens in the real economy, like, for example, an extreme weather event or a blockade or, you know, something physical that prevents the movement of goods. These two things are closely interlinked, but in some ways they've become more and more separate as time has gone on. And we've learned to focus much more on the kind of ethereal fantasy economy than we have on the everyday economy. We kind of don't really care about the everyday economy anymore. No one bothers asking, really. No one particularly cares in a position of decision making. Oh, you know, how are people's wages doing? What's poverty like? What's inequality like? Are people happy? You know, what about things like community cohesion? That's a really critical factor in determining actually levels of productivity in an economy. Like, do people feel rooted in their places? Do they feel valued? Do they feel connected? All these things are really, really important. But economists don't care about stuff like that. They care about corporate profits. They care about share prices. They care about what everyone else in financial markets think is going to happen tomorrow. They don't actually care what's going to happen tomorrow. They care what everyone else thinks is going to happen tomorrow, because that determines whether or not everyone else buys a share. And then if everyone else buys a share, the price goes up. So we are so hyper-focused on this, you know, this economy that is divorced from what is going on in the everyday. And it has, I would argue, led to a lot of really bad policy decisions. It's the foundations of Trumpism, right? Trump's whole appeal is him saying, I am going to come into power and I am going to boost financial markets. That's what he did last time. He delivered a huge round of tax cuts for corporations. Corporations were like, great, we have loads more money. We're going to give that all out to our shareholders. And because we think the economy is the stock market, and if the economy gets better, then I'm richer, everyone thought, great, stock market going up. Even if you as an individual don't have any shares, which most people don't. Sure, you might have a 401k, you might have a pension fund investment, but like that's not a direct benefit to you right now. That Trump has basically created this short-termist model of tax cuts that mean, you know, corporations are dishing out profits to their investors. So that kind of brain rot, the economy is the stock market, like lie, is so central to the way that these decisions are made, and it is really, really problematic. I actually remember not that long ago, Rachel Reeves, back in the day when I worked at a think tank, she asked me to write for this pamphlet that she was creating as part of the Fabian Society on the everyday economy. She was like, the everyday economy is so important. We need to focus on things like social infrastructure, who is providing care, how are communities kind of working together to manage their local resources? Can we do things like insourcing, community wealth building, where local institutions work together to, let's say, buy services from local firms to create local jobs? All of this sort of like, not particularly revolutionary stuff, but stuff that would have a real impact on people's lives. And now that she's in power, all of that's out the window. And it's not just because she suddenly changed her mind. It's because all of the pressure around her comes from the executives whose wealth and power depends upon the idea that there's going to be growth and that's going to boost stock prices and that's going to make them rich.
But it goes beyond just sort of basic corruption, I feel, right? There's a lot of cronyism. But I'm very weary of the impetus on the left to kind of characterize everybody else as evil and up to no good, essentially. I think surely there's a lot more incompetence at play, But also this relationship, exactly as you're talking about, between the state and the market. The state must also prop up the market for a reason too. Like, the state is getting something from the market. And I worry about this with regards to what will happen when the oil runs out, which is more likely to happen than we transition away from it. That's going to have a hugely negative impact on the untethered economy, because it's our resources that feed into the economy. They're tied one for one. Our economy is our material footprint. And so say we move to a renewable energy source, although that word is a bit dodgy in and of itself, that would therefore decrease the amount of money that is floating around in the economy to then redistribute. So if we can go past the kind of, Starmer's not got a backbone and Rachel Reeves is crumbling under pressure and these people are actually just pretty boring and lack innovative thoughts and imagination, what's the other direction at play here? Like, the market, the financial people really enjoy the state subsidizing them and making sure that their lives get better for obvious reasons. What does the state get out of capitulating to those guys rather than the everyday economy?
So this comes back to what I was saying at the beginning about the balance of power in society, because you're totally right. It would be absurd to say that, all the politicians or the CEOs are just bad guys, right? I would argue that the way that they think of the world has probably been corrupted by a particular ideology that puts profit above everything else. But on some level, they think that this is the right way to do things, right? And it's understandable because of that imbalance of power. Because, if we're not thinking about the state as an abstract entity, but as composed of particular individuals, they know that, for example, if Rachel Reeves doesn't signal that she is serious about the nation's finances, then she is going to face a lot of kind of disruption from bond markets. If she doesn't signal to investors that she's going to create a business-friendly environment, the CBI is going to come after her and wage war against her in the media. There are going to be all these extremely powerful vested interests who come for her and try and get her out of power. And they've done that very successfully multiple times in the past, right? So how do you fight back against that? Well, there has to be a counterforce. Now, what's the counterforce, right? If politicians, the thing I like to say, I think I said in an interview with The Times, which they made out to portray me as very scary, was that politicians need to be as scared of the people voting for them as they are of the people writing the checks. And they're not right now, because the only threat to their power are the people funding them, the people who are able to kind of influence narratives about, government competency, who are able to organize very effectively to make sure that their wishes are enacted. We used to have mass democracies where politicians were concerned about protests in the streets, about workers who could shut down the economy, literally. If the bosses said, we're not going to give you wage increases, workers were like, well, fine, we're not going to come to work. And then things just shut down. So there was a much more even balance there, because politicians had to consider the needs of workers, just as they had to consider the needs of businesses. That was the foundation of social democracy. It was the fact that you had this relatively even balance between workers and bosses, and politicians in the middle trying to mediate between these two groups. That's what we've lost, is a sense of the collective power of ordinary people, both because the labor movement has been crushed, but also because, and this is where I told you I'm writing this new book about individualism. This is where my interest in this idea of individualism comes through, because yes, the labor movement has been crushed and there are lots of barriers that have been put in place to organizing, but that doesn't explain the complete collapse of unions. It doesn't explain the complete collapse of mass democracy and participation in politics. It doesn't explain the complete and utter distrust most people have in political parties and politicians. It doesn't explain the decline in community life and social life. It doesn't explain why we don't trust each other anymore and why we all genuinely believe I have to compete with everyone else to survive, and there's no way we can cooperate ourselves out of this mess. That is an ideology. It's a very, very powerful ideology, because it's what stops us from coming together and going to someone like Rachel Reeves and saying, you have to listen to us, because we're all too busy competing pushing each other out of the way to try and get what we want to be able to express a collective interest. Whereas those at the top are very good at cooperating. Ironically, when we're told we live in this competitive capitalist society where businesses are constantly jostling to get to the top, they cooperate very, very effectively, and we don't.
I think it's such a good point. This idea of, big C conservatives actually being like hugely communitarian as long as you are within their community. And the amount of effort, exactly as you're saying, that has gone in to deliberately divide us, because the numbers are on our side. The safety in numbers in the majority, it's all here. And I can't wait to read your new book, because that understanding how that sense of solitude has permeated everything we do, and even on the left, how I think Ash Sarkar's new book is sort of about this, and I'm going to riff on it a little bit, but essentially this idea that like even a politics of liberation has become about self and identity rather than a communal movement to benefit everybody. It's an absolute travesty. Or on the left, how there's so many factions between us. Rather than, again, this attempt to coalesce and come together, let alone go to the other side and be like, listen, we have different politics, but we have pretty similar goals because things are pretty shit, aren't they? Why don't you come on over? It's warm over here. So I think that's a great point. I am aware that we're running out of time, and I really want you to talk about your latest project that you've just launched before we close. So please, you've been analysing the situation for over a decade now.
God, that is depressing, but yes, I suppose I have.
Yeah, and things haven't gotten better. So Grace, what can we do about it?
I'm glad you asked, because I've just started a Substack called What Can We Do? No, look, I've realized like I get this question all the time, and I think I started off my career analyzing the problem a lot because that's what I found so interesting. Part of the reason I started doing this, it was partly because I wanted to change the world, but it was also because I loved the ideas. I loved understanding the way that capitalism works. And I got very, very embedded in communities where that was like the be all and end all. And it's been recently that I've been like, okay, no, understanding things is not enough. And it's also not enough to do what I had been doing before then, which was kind of policy work, saying, well, if we could implement this set of solutions, then things would be better. And then just handing over a list of policies and saying, do this, right? Because if you don't have a political movement that's capable of making those demands known, nothing's going to happen. So I decided it was about time that I started coming up with an answer to this question, what can we do? But I also realized that I was not, as a kind of political economist, best placed to be able to do that on my own. So I've started doing interviews every week with people in different parts of this movement. And I use a very broad understanding of what this movement is. It's from, the labor movement to climate activists to community organizers trying to save, their green spaces and their libraries. It's a very, very broad understanding of what it means to participate in any form of collective organizing, because I want to give anyone a route in to thinking, okay, well, actually, there's something that I could do right now to challenge the state of the world, or actually to win something, because people are winning. Starbucks workers, Amazon workers taking on the biggest corporations on the planet and being able to form unions after we've been told that they're dead. Like climate activists being able to stop pipelines, community organizers, indigenous activists being able to save their places. All of this stuff is happening, and you know it because this is what you do as well. There are so many hopeful stories out there, but we are so wedded to doom scrolling that we just don't want to see it. So check out my Substack, What Can We Do? And there'll be a new story up there every week that hopefully will give you a bit of optimism.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Grace. I think news like that is so important in today's world. Just to remind everyone that there are multiple worlds all here, all the time, existing all around us. It's not just this kind of neoliberal hellscape that's affecting, actually a pretty small percentage of the world's population, if you think about it, in a sense. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
Oh, I hadn't thought about this one. Okay, who are my people? So I like some of my favorite people at the moment, and this is just off the top of my head because I haven't had a chance to think about it. Michaela Loach, a wonderful climate activist and an author. My friend Adele Walton has just released her first book, and she's a really, really interesting thinker. And you're really cool. Those are my people who are in my brain right now. So yeah.
Well, brilliant. Well, I will reach out to Michaela and Adele and try to get them both on the show to continue this conversation.
You should, yeah.
Thank you so much for your time and for all of your work. You are such a kind of ray of decent thinking, not just decent intellectually, but, you know, in the heart way as well in the UK. So thank you for all you do.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It was great to chat to you.
Yeah, you too. If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.